So I'm pretty sure a lot of you may remember this device, the Google Pixel 3 XL. When it first came out, first of all, there were so many rumors, circulating around this phone, which is so interesting because we have phones like the Google Pixel 5 right now, and there wasn't really that much hype about it. Google just kind of released it, and I kind of feel like the Pixel lineup is going to be one of those devices that just kind of is so obscure, and it's going to be a slow fall from grace in my opinion. Now, I hope I'm totally wrong because I love the Pixel lineup, but I feel like a lot of these problems kind of originated from the Pixel 3 XL, and I'm predicting it now. I've seen it done before with HTC and even Motorola, and I feel like it's about to happen with the Pixel lineup as well, unless Google releases another device that is just so crazy and has so much functionality. I feel like they're taking an interesting approach with the Pixel 5 and the Pixel 4a and even the 4a 5G, but the Pixel 3 XL, I'll definitely tell you, is a device that is just such an interesting concept, and I don't know the best way to put it, but it just had everything going for it except for one area, which is the panel itself, the screen, and it had Google just done a good job with the panel, just like how they did with the Pixel 2 XL. I feel like this would be one of those devices that would age like fine wine or whatever the little terminology is. It would have aged so well because there's really not anything super crazy wrong with it. There were no major hardware defects, I think, except for like one thing, ironically, with the panel. But I think for the most part, the Pixel 3 XL would have been one of those devices that people would still recommend to this day. And I'll definitely tell you, this phone has been out for over 2 years now. And I think in this day and age, the Pixel 3 XL is one of those devices that lives in its own bubble. I don't think a lot of people know about it or remember it, but I think a lot of people remember the original Pixel and Pixel XL and the Pixel 2 XL. I feel like those devices were amazing. And then the Pixel 3 XL, because of that panel, Google just took a different approach. Now this thing, like I said, is over 2 years old. The front panel is 6.3 inches, and surprisingly, it really isn't a bad panel. Like, it's actually a pretty decent panel for the most part. It's 1440p, 523 pixels per inch, which is actually a pretty good number. And I feel like the panel itself, the actual way it looks and everything about it was very, very good, very premium. The only problem was, and this was the biggest problem, was the bezel on the bottom and the top bezel notch thing, whatever you're going to call it. This was I don't know who made this, who designed it, and I don't even know what they were going for. That notch was very, very inappropriate. Like, if there was any time a phone made me super uncomfortable, it was probably this phone. Typically what we've seen when, eventually Google did, fix this problem with the Pixel 4 and 4 XL, we've seen, kind of equal bezels around. So if there's a top bezel, there's a bottom bezel. If there's a big one, there's a top one on the whatever. We very rarely have seen a notch and like a bottom bezel, very rarely do we see that. And this was, I think, the first time that we saw it on a major phone. And I think this was the last time that we saw it on a major phone as well. And I think it's because of this panel, this phone isn't really talked about. Nobody really cares about it. And that's a sad thing. This was actually a pretty decent phone. It had a pretty good camera at the time. The front cameras were pretty decent. The software experience is beautiful. But because of the weird approach that they did with design, that's why people don't really talk about it. And even with this video, it's probably not going to get that many views because of the lack of this phone. And I just want this video to not get any views because just to prove this point, in my opinion, that the design has everything to do with the hype of a phone. Now, if this video randomly gets a lot of views, then maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But how can they make a device like this? You look at a phone like the Google Pixel 2 XL, like I've stated before, that phone was perfect in my opinion. Yes, there were defects, but it was a perfect phone that I would still recommend. That phone's like less than $100 in a lot of places. This phone is also, I think, less than $150. And if you want to pick one up, be my guest. I'll find the cheapest one on Amazon. I'll link it down in the description below. You can get it from there and help support the channel at the same time. But I don't know, I can talk about this panel all day, but you had a USB Type-C port on the bottom, and on the back you had that fingerprint sensor, which is really good. But above that, you actually had that single camera setup, which in and of itself was actually not a bad camera, and it was arguably one of the best cameras of that year, I believe, back in 2018. This thing had that 12.2 megapixel wide angle lens. You could do 4K at 30 on it, which I think was pretty cool, and no 4K at 60. So in this day and age, it may be a little outdated, but you can still do 1080p at 120 on this phone. So I think for a lot of people, it may be okay. But again, this phone came out in 2018. It was kind of in that cusp where we were starting to do 4K at 60, as a whole, kind of as a baseline. Definitely any phone after 2019, probably even any phone after this, 4K at 60 is like the bare minimum. But the quality of these photos and videos from this device were actually pretty good. And Google has a humongous plus side to it and a huge advantage when it comes down to the software enhancements. Their software enhancements of their devices are so good when it comes down to these type of things that it just makes sense for Google to make a camera. They need to just make their own DSLR because the quality and capability behind that type of camera is going to be just insane. And with this type of quality, it was definitely good, and it was actually probably great. But unfortunately, it didn't have a dual camera setup like we had on a lot of these other devices too, such as the iPhone XS and the iPhone X and all that stuff. But still, I'll definitely tell you, with this type of device, it's definitely okay. It's not going to be like a bad camera in this day and age. But like I stated, it would have been nice had this thing had a dual camera setup. But funny enough, it did have a dual camera setup on the front camera. You had a double 8 megapixels lens on it. You had that wide angle and ultra wide sensor. And I think that in and of itself is another huge thing about this device that had a lot more capability than a lot of other phones that came out. And I think at the end of the day, that's a very, very cool thing. So the camera setup on this thing, I think is very interesting. In this day and age, I think it's still pretty good, but just keep in mind, no ultra wide, no telephoto, no 4K 60 on the front or back. So those are just a couple things to keep in mind. But in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up. Now, software wise, this is another area where Pixel phones just are literally the best in. This thing is going to be getting Android 11. I think it's going to be getting Android 12 as well. And it's going to probably stop there on native support. But here's the important thing to keep in mind. This thing has so much of a development community behind it that you can get this thing now and it's still going to last you a long time in software support. Software for the Pixel lineup has never been an issue. For a lot of other Android devices, it typically is. So with the phone that came out in 2018, the same Samsung device, which was the Galaxy S9, that thing is already outdated. That thing got Android 10 and it's going to be getting some security updates here and there, but it's not going to be lasting that long. Like I'm sure everyone already knows, Samsung devices have now changed though, but for the most part, you're going to be getting a longer software support on something like a Pixel than on a Samsung or maybe even a OnePlus in some cases, but definitely more than like an LG or like Motorola or whatever other device. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. Now performance wise, and I just want to say, funny enough, I don't know if Motorola made this device. They have made like Pixel phones in the past or something like that. And Motorola is not owned by Google or something. But for sure, when it comes down to the performance of this device, is actually pretty good as well. As stated before, this thing has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset, an octa-core CPU, Adreno 630 GPU, and 4 gigs of RAM on each model. There were 2 different models, both with 64 and then 128 gig models, which I don't understand why. But at the end of the day, the performance on this phone still isn't anything really to complain about too much. I think one of the bigger disadvantages of this specific device was maybe the lack of the amount of RAM. But as stated before, phones like the Galaxy S9, the S8, other devices that came out around that year also had the same amount of RAM as this one. So it wasn't really an insane difference. So I think that's kind of an advantage when it comes down to it. But definitely this phone is still smooth. It's still fairly fast for the most part. So it's not like you're going to pick up this phone and feel like you have a super outdated or slow phone. But because of that notch, I can't even explain it over the camera or through this microphone. But it's just that notch that just throws you off. Like it makes it feel like such a weird phone for no reason at all. Like I don't know why Google did that. It just doesn't make any sense. The more you think about it, the more confusing it gets. So that's why I kind of stopped making videos about this phone. But like it's such an interesting concept they did. And I don't know what they were thinking, but they were thinking about something. But performance wise, I think you're going to be okay for the most part. And I think for really anything you're going to do, obviously it's going to be fine. It's definitely not going to be extremely fast. A phone like a Pixel 5, even honestly a Pixel 4a may do you better than this phone. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But I think when it comes down to it, the performance of this phone is definitely okay for the most part. Now, the battery life honestly hasn't really maintained that well for me for some reason. It didn't really have an insanely huge battery life at that time, but I think it's okay for a majority of people. 3430. It was a 3430 mAh battery, which actually I take that back. It's actually pretty decently sized. And I don't know why I think my battery has degraded a lot. So it really isn't that great. Maybe it's Android 10 or something like that. But I'll definitely tell you, at the end of the day, the Pixel 3 XL is only worth it to you if you can get over that notch. If you can get over that hump on the screen, then I think it's definitely a really good phone. And there's just not that much to complain about other than the panel. It's a tremendous phone for the most part. Now, is it perfect? Or is it horrible? Because it's definitely not perfect. But is it the worst phone ever? Absolutely not. I've had way worse phones than this. And this phone, it didn't have an insane amount of impact. It didn't have an insane amount of anything. But it was a pretty good phone at the end of the day. And I think that's something that, you can't take it away from this device. I think it had a lot of capability at the time. And I just feel like it was only plagued by that notch. Had that notch been what it was, then this phone would have been honestly still a really good phone that a lot of people would still use. But because the notch it is what it is, I don't know, like had they made it a little bit better, had they made it a little bit better looking or all that stuff, then it would have been perfectly fine. But again, because the phone was how it was, there's just nothing we can do about it. And it's really unfortunate because this could have made it a really timeless phone in a lot of ways. But in terms of everything, that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.